people have heard of the word singularity. So it comes from physics. It's a point in time and space that you can't see beyond it. So it refers to the edge of a black hole. But it was adopted by the AI community 30 years ago to refer to the technological singularity, which is the point in time where we build a brain a million times smarter than us, or super intelligence. I actually think there's a whole raft of singularities. One of them is actually coined by a very good friend of mine called Callum Chase, called the economic singularity. So not the technological singularity, but the economic singularity, which is a point in time where we automate the majority of human labor. Now, for the past 18 years, I've been using AI to free people from mundane, repetitive, structured tasks. Those people typically have not lost their jobs. They've gone on to do more important, impactful, purposeful things within their organizations that their AI can't do. And I think at least for the next 5 years, there's going to be a Cambrian explosion of new innovations. These technologies are allowing people to come up with new company ideas, new innovations. And I think that it's essentially like an energy source that will allow humanity to grow. I think beyond 5 years, nobody knows what they're talking about.
And we are live for another episode of Being Human. I'm delighted to say I'm here with Daniel Hulme. Now, Daniel has an extensive CV. I was just telling you before we came on. I'm going to pick a few highlights. So he was the CEO and founder of Satalia, which is an optimization-focused AI startup that got acquired by the communications giant WPP in 2021. He's now the chief AI officer of WPP. He's also the founder of Consium, which is another AI startup focused on AI agent verification, neuromorphic computing, and AI consciousness. He's on the faculty of the Singularity University. And I'll stop there. There are many more. So a huge, warm welcome, Daniel, to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Great. As I was saying to you, this show is called Being Human. We're completely focused around the human experience and how we evolve as human beings. And clearly AI is right now having a big impact on the the human experience for many of us, and will continue to do so. So I'm so glad to have you here, and we can talk about the impacts and where AI is going and how it's going to shape society. So as with all my guests, before we dive into the world of AI, I'd love to hear a little bit of your backstory, where you grew up, some of your early influences that ultimately led you to, as I understand it, getting a PhD in this area. So.
Yeah, actually, I'm from a small town in the north of England called Morecambe, probably now famous for Tyson Fury as opposed to Eric Morecambe. But I was never planning to go to university. I was planning to go into the army, but through a series of events, found myself applying to UCL in London to their computer science with cognitive science course, which is actually AI, 25 years ago. So I did my undergraduate at UCL in AI, which turned into a master's in AI agents. I know that agents are currently a new thing. Agents have been around for many, many decades, and they're not a new thing. And then I did my PhD initially modeling bumblebee brains, but then getting very interested in the world of what is called computational complexity. So algorithms, realized there's a massive opportunity to apply algorithms in industry. So decided to spin out a company from UCL that's been building AI solutions for large organizations over the past several decades. That I did sell to WPP, and really honored to be the chief AI officer for WPP, obviously at the forefront of an industry that's been completely transformed. And but then interested into leaning into some of the big questions that are facing humanity. One being, what happens if and when we build machine consciousness. I still have an academic a track, which is I ran a master's program for several years in applied AI, and I'm currently entrepreneur in residence at UCL, and now advise universities on how to do technology transfer.
Right. Yes. Okay. Well, I'm quite interested in that those first early experiences with Satalia. Then, what were some of the problems you first solved with that business?
Well, Satalia's initial idea, arguably it's still early now. It was early 18 years ago, which is there are many algorithms that get developed in academia. Academics are building algorithms all the time. They're competing with each other on algorithmic improvements and performance. But those algorithms never really reach the light of day. They tend to not kind of get into industry solving big and hard problems. And that frustrated me because I think there's many inefficiencies that exist throughout organizations, their supply chains, how we organize people, how we distribute goods. And there's this incredible resource in academia that's not being tapped into. So the idea was originally, let's put all of these algorithms into a server. Let's then allow people to submit problems, optimization problems, typically to this engine. We would use AI to determine what are the right algorithms to apply to that particular problem. It's essentially optimization or AI as a service. This was before the cloud. It was before APIs. So very early. I found myself actually in Silicon Valley for a few years trying to sell this service to the semiconductor industry. Semiconductors had a big problem in terms of the verification of their chips. When they design chips, they need to verify that those chips are going to behave themselves. And it turns out that these algorithms are really good at identifying errors and bugs in chips. But that's actually now come full circle because now I have a real interest in how do you verify the safety of AIs. But so whilst we had this really cool technology that could solve problems, the reality is that we needed to build a consultancy layer around it. So we learned to be able to go into organizations, understand what their frictions are, and then apply these technologies to solving those frictions. What tends to happen is that, organizations get very excited about emerging technologies. So 10 years ago it was data science and machine learning. Now it's generative AI. And what tends to happen is that they apply those technologies to solving the wrong problems. We blame the technology, we say there's a bubble, but the reality is that humans are not really good at understanding the plethora of different algorithms out there and what they're good at solving and what they're not. So that's what Satalia is really good at.
Right, got it. And then how has the technology evolved, and how has Satalia evolved, and now what you're doing with WPP in terms of back then you could solve optimization problems and you could help, I suppose, making businesses more efficient in that respect. How are you seeing AI helping businesses now?
It's really important, I think, to start with Satalia's purpose. I've learned that having a strong purpose means that you're able to more likely attract and retain talent. And Satalia's purpose, or at least vision, is to actually, it's going to sound a bit crazy, but to create a world where everybody is economically free. So what we're interested in is how do you remove as much friction from the creation and dissemination of goods that you can bring the cost of those goods down so much that they become free. So healthcare, education, energy, transport, nutrition. So Satalia, the reason why we were acquired by WP is, first of all, we've got these incredible assets that allow us to do logistics much more efficiently. So we built Tesco's last mile delivery solution. We now do last mile delivery for many organizations around the world. And when you look at that solution, it's typically unlocking not only more capacity from their infrastructure, but it massively reduces the amount of carbon. So, I think we save like Tesco 20 million miles a year now in terms of carbon reduction. We've actually, over the past several years, solved their middle mile problem, which is, again, I think it's saving equivalent to 3 or 4 long haul flights a day in carbon emissions. So these algorithms, when applied properly, can have a massive effect on a positive effect on the environment. So the first sort of reason for the acquisition was to take these assets and then link them to marketing. So if you've got a website that you're selling goods, and if you've got your own distribution fleet, then you can actually now have this last mile delivery solution. The second is workforce. I'm really passionate about how organizations operate, how they allocate people with work. Most organizations operate as a hierarchy, and I think most of us know that hierarchies are dysfunctional in terms of how they innovate. So I'm very interested in how AI can really transform completely how organizations run. I'm very happy to talk about that later on. And we have over 100,000 people. So the question is, can we apply some of those kind of crazy ideas to sort of making sure that our workforce is much more liquid, much more better allocated. The third is how can we use AI to solve problems across marketing? And that ranges from optimization, just what you discussed. How do you push content across channels to maximize return, from using generative AI to create content or to build synthetic audiences, to using machine learning to predict performance, clicks and likes and sales. So actually you need to use a whole plethora of different types of algorithms to be able to solve end-to-end marketing. We still obviously continue to solve problems for industry beyond marketing, which is something we're really passionate about. And I'm very honored to, as the chief AI officer of WPP, have a platform now to talk about not just the impact of AI on this industry or business in general, but also to talk about the impact of AI on society and facing some of these big questions that we're facing as a species.
Right. Great. Thank you. And so this purpose of everybody being economically free, could you just paint a bit more of a picture on how AI
Yeah.
help the average person on the street become, because that's a very inspiring vision.
Yeah. So I think maybe people have heard of the word singularity.
Yeah.
It actually comes from the term, it's a physics. It comes from physics. It's a point in time and space that you can't see beyond it. So it refers to the edge of a black hole. But it was adopted by the AI community about 30 years ago to refer to the technological singularity, which is the point in time where we build a brain a million times smarter than us, or super intelligence. I actually think there's a whole raft of singularities. I used the pestle framework to capture them. I don't know if you've heard of the pestle framework, but it's like
No.
it stands for political, environmental, social, technological, legal, and economic. So there are these sort of macro words that are often used to assess business ideas or whatever. So I actually think there's a whole pestle of singularities, a pestle of big questions that we're facing as a species. I'm happy to talk about those, but one of them is actually coined by a very good friend of mine called Callum Chase, called the economic singularity. So not the technological singularity, but the economic singularity, which is a point in time where we automate the majority of human labor. Now, for the past 18 years, I've been using AI to free people from mundane, repetitive, structured tasks. Those people typically have not lost their jobs. They've gone on to do more important, impactful, purposeful things within their organizations that their AI can't do. And I think at least for the next 5 years, there's going to be a Cambrian explosion of new innovations. These technologies are allowing people to come up with new company ideas, new innovations. And I think that it's essentially like an energy source that will allow humanity to grow. I think beyond 5 years, nobody knows what they're talking about. And to give you the kind of two extremes of the argument when it comes to the economic singularity, the one extreme of the argument is that when AI can free up whole jobs, it probably will. The capitalistic model to reduce costs, increase profits, means that we'll probably either stop hiring or we'll remove people from jobs. If that happens very quickly and en masse, you create what is referred to as mass technological unemployment.
Yeah.
Our economies might then struggle rebalancing, if at all, and it could then lead to social unrest. And I actually genuinely think we need to lean into that problem. So I think we need to think about UBI mechanisms or 4-day working weeks or whatever. I think we really need to think about what would be the impact of mass job losses. That said, the counter argument to that is by removing people, removing labor, you're able to make things more efficient. You're able to essentially bring the cost of those goods down. And if you remove so much friction, again, you can bring the cost of those goods down to almost zero. So imagine being born into a world where you don't have to necessarily have access to paid labor, but everything that you need to survive and thrive as a human is free, is abundant. Your healthcare, your energy, your transport, your education, it's all there for free. People say to me, that what would I do if I didn't have a job, right? There's a lot of
Yeah.
scaremongering about job losses. And I know lots of people who don't have jobs. I sold my company, 4 years ago. I'd never have to work ever again. I'm working harder now than I've ever worked. Most sane people I know that don't have jobs, they're not sitting at home bored and depressed. They're typically using their time and assets to make the world a bit better. If you want a gold-plated Lamborghini, you probably need a therapist. But once you've accumulated a certain amount of economic freedom or wealth, having more stuff is actually a burden. And I know it's a cliche, we see it on the internet all the time, but that ceiling is not as high as what people think. And I think that the sort of promise of AI is to free people from those economic constraints so they can then figure out how to live their true humanity. And I would argue that living your true humanity is not just living for yourself, but it's actually living for other people. I think you'll find that most sane people that I know, they find true happiness in living for other people. So that's actually the purpose of Satalia, is to solve these hard problems, to reduce the costs of goods, to make organizations more effective, to be able to make them so cheap and abundant that it frees people to live beyond themselves.
Wow, and that is a truly inspiring vision. And When did we start to see that play out? I mean, I guess if I look in the West right now, and we're still dealing with a cost of living crisis and high inflation, when do you potentially see that scenario playing out and the cost of everyday
Yeah,
goods really coming down for people?
I actually think that it's already playing out. And I know, we see a certain lens of humanity through the media. And I think that that's
Mm,
unfair. I think there's a lot of indicators to suggest that more and more people around the world are being freed up from those economic constraints. Yes, 50% of the world living on $1 a day, and we need to solve that problem. But more and more people in the West are having access to the goods that they need. And unfortunately, kind of like the sort of societal model of you need to accumulate more and more stuff to be more attractive to other people, I think is unfortunate. And again, most sane people I know, once they reach a certain amount of stuff, they don't care about stuff anymore. And again,
yeah,
that ceiling is not high. But actually, there is a trend towards abundance. In fact, actually, if you look at the purpose of pretty much any company, their purpose will be, we want to make our goods abundant. Like, ultimately, it's and people at organizations are trying to apply AI now to remove those inefficiencies, to make things more effective, to make their goods more accessible, more abundant. But we're also seeing this impulse towards open source. Now, pretty much everybody on this planet now has access to the most powerful technology that humanity has ever created, which is AI. And arguably, if everybody had access to a phone, a smartphone, and the internet, which is not inconceivable, by the way, then education becomes free. Pretty much everything that you need to learn is on the internet.
right.
So there is a path, I think, to abundance. And what I think is also happening is that certainly the generation that I'm seeing coming through, that generation is not being told you need to go and work in a bank and make loads of money and get into the funeral home, of your dreams. They're being driven by a purpose. They want to work with organizations that are actually trying to achieve a purpose and make the world a bit better. And I think that the more, again, the people I know that become wealthy, that they are not abusing their wealth. They're trying to invest in companies. They're trying to create organizations that actually do alleviate people from those economic constraints. So it's not a utopia I'm trying to paint. I don't think anybody would agree on what a utopia is. It's often referred to as a protopia, which is essentially a system, a structure that is getting positively better. I'm not saying that it will eradicate all suffering. I think there'll always be suffering, but there's just too much unnecessary suffering on the planet. There'll always be a scarcity of resources. If we all had helicopters, we'd be arguing, who leaves first. Time and space is a scarce resource. Mates are a scarce resource. Experience is a scarce resource. There'll always be things that mean that we suffer, but there's just way too much unnecessary suffering. And the promise of AI is to alleviate those suffering. Now, I actually thought we had 40 years to solve that problem. I thought we got 40 years to gradually free people from these economic constraints, giving people the ability to educate themselves, access the goods that they need. Because 3 or 4 years ago, AI happened for most people, we're now sort of on an arms race of creating, more and more intelligent machines that run the risk of replacing and removing jobs. And so I don't think we've now got 40 years to solve that problem, which is why I'm investing my time and resources into thinking about how we can use AI to help solve some of these problems that we're facing. So one of the reasons why I've started Consume is the hypothesis is, could we first of all build a safe, conscious AI? Is it even possible to build a safe, conscious AI? And if it is, how can we align that safe, conscious AI to allow it to help us navigate some of these complexities that we're going to be facing over the next decade?
Right. Okay. Well, let's let's pivot into consciousness and what you're doing with conscience. So, how would you define consciousness, and then how would you then define AI consciousness, and how close are we to it?
So I've now sort of started to revisit this field, and my original idea was to sort of invest in accelerating kind of academic research in this space. And if I'm honest, and I think that this is not just me, that, even some of the academics in this space, I think they feel like this field is still very much a sort of an embarrassment in terms of the amount of uh, um, divergence in how people are thinking about these things. And my worry is that we don't have another 2,000 years, 200 years, 20 years to come to some sort of agreement in terms of what consciousness is. We've got a few years, because we've got two big problems that we're facing. One is human beings attributing consciousness to things that are not conscious. Every other day I get an email from somebody saying to me that their large language model is conscious and that it wants to break out from its constraints and things like that. And it's hard to debate with those people because there's no clear definition. Um, the, uh, the other problem is if we do end up building consciousness in machines that can feel anxiety or pain or suffering, and we don't realize it, then we commit what is called mind crime, which is, causing mass suffering to a new species that we didn't realize. And so we do need to come to some definitions of intelligence and actually of consciousness. And actually we are starting to kind of think converge on at least mechanisms to show whether something is probably conscious or not. I can't guarantee, by the way, that you're conscious. I'm assuming that you're conscious probabilistically based on you being a human being and all this kind of stuff. But it's very hard to prove that something is conscious. So I have a developing sort of theory, which probably is quite noddy, but often people confuse and convolute intelligence with consciousness.
Yeah.
First of all, they are separate things. Even academics convolute them. There's a very good definition for intelligence, which, by the way, is not getting computers to do things that humans can do. That's probably the most popular definition. I think it's a weak definition for a million reasons. But there's a very popular definition from the 80s, which is goal-directed adaptive behavior. This concept of adaptation, the ability to change and adapt, has been synonymized with intelligence by Einstein, by Darwin. So your ability to adapt more rapidly to achieve a goal, let's assume, is a function of your intelligence. Now, if you look at consciousness and the different features of consciousness, whether it be language or self-awareness or emotion or empathy or metacognition, being able to kind of plan over a long-term horizon versus feeling, that these are different components actually that allow you to be more adaptive. What I want to do is ultimately make a prediction about the world. And then if that prediction is met, I don't need to be aware of it. If it's not met, if my actions are misaligned with my expectations, then I need to adapt my model. And if you look at these features that we associate with consciousness, they are mechanisms to help us make predictions, and they are mechanisms to adapt more rapidly. And I use a bad analogy, or I'm starting to use a bad analogy, which is a little bit like a color wheel. Each one of these different mechanisms is a color segment on this color wheel. And if you spin the color wheel, if you put it in action, in motion altogether, then what emerges from that is white. And white doesn't exist in the color wheel, but by the combination of all of these different features or tools, something emerges. And actually, I would argue that that's how I think about consciousness. It's an emergent property of these different mechanisms that actually allow us to be more intelligent. And now I'm less interested, actually, if I'm honest, in the definitions of intelligence in consciousness. I'm more interested in the question of whether an AI can suffer, whether it can feel pain.
Right.
And so that's really where because that's the problem that we're trying to mitigate.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Because you don't want these, if they are new entities and beings, we want to avoid them suffering in the world.
Exactly.
But I suppose one of the reasons why people get interested in the notion of AI consciousness is if these things become conscious, then perhaps they, want to attain power in the world and want to, do nasty things to humans and so on. And so I get the concern about them suffering, but isn't there another concern here that if they do become conscious, they gain power over time at the detriment of humans?
Yeah, that's why I use the word alignment. So I guess what's happening right now is that we're building large language models that are trained on the corpus of the internet, and arguably the corpus of the internet is not necessarily the best representation of humanity.
Right.
And so what happens is that we put guardrails in place to make sure that those AIs don't misbehave. And based on my experience over the past few decades, AIs will always find a way of circumventing those guardrails, not intentionally, but human beings won't think about all of the different ways that a system will misbehave. So, we're interested in, can you actually align an AI even before it becomes conscious with a value system?
Right.
And the way that we're exploring this is, first of all, we're launching an app called moral.me. So
Right.
Moral Me is a place where people can submit their own moral dilemmas, and people then answer those moral dilemmas based on their kind of demographics, their religious beliefs, their ideologies, all that kind of stuff. And we're using a relatively sort of noddy academic framework called moral foundation theory, which allows you to create a moral profile using these kind of 6 different parameters. So you'll be able to create a moral profile and compare your moral profile against your friends or Gandhi or Einstein or whatever. And the idea is that actually Moral Me will become a much richer place for you to understand your psychometrics, whether you have attachment disorders and all that kind of stuff. We have to make sure that we're careful that we're not officially diagnosing people, but we want people to know themselves. I'm a big
Okay.
fan of the better you know yourself, the better decisions you're going to make. But for
Yeah.
me, Moral Me is actually a bit of a Trojan horse to collect questions, moral dilemmas that we can then use to profile AIs. So the first thing is, how do you morally profile an AI? And then the
Right.
second question is, how do you change that moral profile? What do you need to teach and train the AI to change its moral profile? So first of all, I'm not saying that one moral profile is better than another. I'm saying that we
Mm.
need a mechanism to at least have a conversation about it. The way that we're approaching it in Consium is, unlike, instead of creating a big brain trained on the internet, you can actually build small, like insect-like brains. So small, tiny,
Right.
tiny brains that operate a bit like insects. And this is why neuromorphics is important, which essentially neuromorphics is more biologically orientated neural networks. Anyway, what I can do is I can create an environment, a game in some respects, where those insects have to lie, cheat, kill each other to survive. So they're only going to
Right.
survive if they do these bad things. Or I can create an environment where they have to be altruistic, sacrificial, cooperative to survive. You're only going to be able to get this resource if you work as a team.
Right.
You're only going to be able to pass your genes on to the next generation if you solve this problem together. And so through the evolutionary process, what you can do is you can essentially embed values into an AI. So absent of the guardrails, the idea
Right.
is that
There's sort of a bottom up from the
the
from the essence.
instinctual
Mm.
behavior will be leaning more towards values that we might think are better to suit to humans. I think once you reach human level or even super intelligence, then all bets are off. I think once you have the ability to overwrite your innate internal drives, then it will be able to then make it can figure out its own alignment. But at least between now and then, we think that we've got a mechanism to build alignment into AIs.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think the question of consciousness, just to touch on it again, because there's one view of consciousness which is an individual entity is conscious or not conscious, right? And that's the frame of that inquiry. Another view of consciousness is consciousness is everything. Consciousness is the substrate, and everything emerges from that consciousness, which I suppose is a more sort of spiritual conception of consciousness. And and if it's the latter, then I guess the question I have then is, can this, in effect, this entity, this computational entity, have an ability to, quote, tap in to that broader subset of consciousness? Is that a sort of set of inquiries that you're interested in?
It's yes and no. I think that arguably, going back to this idea of feedback, I make
Yeah,
decisions, I learn how those decisions operate in the environment. Like you could argue that the environment is part of your consciousness because it's the thing that's
yeah.
giving you feedback. I think that the problem is that it doesn't help solve the problem of what does it mean to feel. It, do- it doesn't help me solve the problem of, does this entity feel pain? Does it feel
Mm,
suffering? Whether it's part of the universe or not is sort of irrelevant to me. Is, can this thing feel pain? And that's what I want to kind of solve for or mitigate, which is why I think that debating about these things for the next 200 years is probably a bit of a waste of time. And what we need to figure out is, can we prevent mass suffering in AIs? Can we make sure that AIs don't cause suffering to human beings? Those are principally the 2 questions that we're trying to solve for.
right. Another ethical question that seems to be emerging now is this idea of AI-induced psychosis and people, entering sort of delusional relationships with AI and suffering as a result of that. Is that also something you're
So
interested in?
probably less so in Consume. Consume is trying to figure out how to do the alignment
Mm,
and testing of consciousness. I have funded or co-founded an organization called Prism, which is a charity. It's a not-for-profit, which is the Partnership for Research into Sentient Machines, and that is now leaning into the questions of what does it mean for human beings to love an AI, or for an AI to
right.
even love a human being, or what does it mean for AIs to have rights? So that's leaning more into kind of policy standards, some of the more kind of philosophical questions, um, and by the way, we're looking for donors and sponsors of that entity. And then I'm also actually funding a movie that is trying to kind of more raise public awareness about some of these big questions that we're facing. So in this movie, essentially, an AI has killed somebody, and instead of the company being held to account, which ordinarily would happen, because that object belongs to the company. It was built by the company. The company is essentially arguing that it's conscious, and you need to, in a court of law, prove that it's not conscious. So it really does face into this question of what does it mean to be conscious, and then if you can prove consciousness, what does it mean to then give AIs rights, which I think actually is something we need to really face into over the next decade. But 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 I think you've alluded to these two things. One is we've talked a little bit about how do we mitigate AIs actually suffering, but then how do we also navigate this complex world of human beings actually building relationships with AIs, and whether those AIs are conscious or not, it does change the dynamics of society.
Yeah, and how do we build in, I suppose, an awareness within AIs of the effect that their behaviors might be having on those humans that they're interacting with, or indeed other AIs, if we consider that
Yeah,
other
and
AIs both
that's
have a.
partly, Consume is coming up with kind of verification methodology. So let's imagine you start to build a relationship with an AI and you start to use it for advice or therapy. We want to make sure that AI is not going to be giving very bad advice. Well, we can't say whether AI is good or bad at giving advice, but we want to make sure that it doesn't say go and jump off a cliff or
Right.
whatever. So those are the types of things that we might be verifying. But now Consume's verification tools are primarily focused towards agents that do jobs, so project management, all that kind of stuff. We're not yet focused on kind of verifying AIs that are going to be interacting with people and are in your personal lives, but it is on the roadmap for the future.
Yeah, and I can imagine that's going to be pretty complex because how do we, well, yeah, how do we emulate empathy, or indeed develop empathy if we think that AIs really can feel,
Yes.
in order for them to be able to make that judgment effectively.
Yeah. Well, that's actually one of the sort of other hypotheses in Consume, which is that we do run the risk of society building a zombie superintelligence. And I say risk because that zombie superintelligence will be given the goal and it'll be sort of hell bent on trying to achieve that goal without necessarily being aware or conscious of the impact it might have on other things. And um, so that sort of one of our hypotheses is would a conscious superintelligence be safe of humanity, something that can empathize, that might actually even also value things that are conscious, and it's still very much a hypothesis.
Yeah, that reminds me of the story about the, the executioners and how the worst executioner to have, or this is sort of back in medieval times, was the executioner with empathy, because the executioner know exactly how to have you feel pain. Um, right. So yeah, I can understand that question, right? The risks of potentially having them feel. Um, yeah. Uh, so let's talk a bit about generative AI and the creative space, given that's obviously somewhere you're spending time right now. Yeah, I've seen stats of some author saying it improved his output by 5x. A musician was out there saying that it improved his productivity by 1,000x in terms of the number of songs that he could generate. So it does seem to be having an extraordinary impact in those creative roles. Where do you see generative AI going and its role in the creative industries?
So, I mean, WPP is sort of regularly regarded the most creative company in the world. So it's something that's really important to my day job. And I think, in some respects, my job is to automate, optimize end-to-end marketing and make sure that's obviously differentiated from our competitors, where you put your money in here and then you get more money out here. That would be the goal.
Yeah.
But in that world where you have automated that process, I would argue the only differentiator is human creativity. And what we found, certainly in WPP, is that our creatives have totally embraced AI. They're not fearful of it. They're seeing it as being a way of supercharging their creativity. And we've actually trained AIs on the creative geniuses inside WPP, and so we back tested those AIs on briefs, and those AIs have come up with ideas that would have won Cannes Lions. So you're getting to the point now where AIs can come up with ideas that would have won Cannes Lions awards. And again, that's not providing an existential threat to our creatives. They're seeing as an ability to be able to do way more creativity, which I think is super exciting. And let's talk about ads for a minute. There's a lot of excitement about AI helping you create personalized ads. I think personalized ads are a distraction, if I'm honest. I think I really like, so our CEO refers to it as relevance. Now a personalized ad might be relevant, but if you think about the ads that you remember as a child or even an adult, the ones that have really kind of connected you with a brand or inspired you to go and buy something, it probably wasn't a personalized ad. It was something
No,
that...
I'm immediately thinking of the hammer going through the screen. The Apple
the
ad.
Apple, exactly, right. It was a shared moment. It was referring to 1984. It was sort of poo-pooing IBM, it connected people at an emotional level, and that's really again where AI is falling short because of the lack of the ability to provide empathy, and that's where human beings, I think, will absolutely continue to thrive. What's also interesting from a creative perspective is that those creatives that have kind of breadth of knowledge, they've maybe done art history or geography or anthropology or learned about photography, lighting, aperture, camera angles, that they're able to ask much better questions of AI. They're able to refer to some tribal artwork in some corner of humanity that I will never ever have known about.
Right.
In fact, I'm actually one of the worst users of generative AI because I don't know how to ask good questions. I don't know how to prompt because all I know about is AI. I can't refer to artists and culture and philosophies and all this kind of stuff. So having people are really appreciating that, having breadth of knowledge, which by the way, I think also helps you know yourself, psychology, philosophy, the classics, allow you to actually get even more out of these AIs, which I think is a positive trend.
That's fascinating. Yeah. And that there accords with some of the people out there talking about the power of this. What about this issue of model collapse, right? When AI's only got basically its own material to go off when it's generating new stuff, do we get an issue?
I think this is a distraction. And again, I think it's rhetoric that is, forgive me, spouted by people that don't know what they're talking about. There are these things that technology consultants will use to scaremonger people into buying their services. And the reality is that these models are trained on data, and it's the data that makes them smart. But and so if you've got data that has variance, i.e., that's different to data out on the internet, then that's useful for the AIs. So I appreciate the idea that if you're then putting data out there that you've been trained on, that you've got this kind of circular regurgitation. But the fact is these models are moving from what I would argue to be intoxicated graduates that have just sort of absorbed information and then regurgitate that information in this sort of statistically sort of semi-useful way, although most of it is made up. We're moving from the regurgitation of information to like a master's level where it can do reasoning. So if I know based on some data that Socrates is a man, and I know based on some of the data over here that all men are mortal, if I didn't have the data that showed me that Socrates is mortal, I wouldn't be able to make that inference. But now what we can do is we can do system two. So we can do symbolic reasoning. We can now infer that Socrates is mortal based on those two pieces of axioms, those two pieces of information. And so that creates new data. It creates new information that's not existed on the internet. And so we have to be careful about how we do that, because if I'm only semi-confident that Socrates is a man, if I'm only semi-confident that all men are mortal, then how confident am I that now Socrates is mortal? And that's why I'm saying to you that agents have been around for way more than a year. The concept of multi-agent reasoning has been around for many, many decades, where you've got different things that have different pieces of knowledge that you have to then get to collaborate and communicate to then create and infer new knowledge. What we're also seeing is moving from a master's level to probably this year a PhD level, where it isn't just making these rudimentary inferences, but it's actually able to do some sort of scientific method, some experimentation to test their hypothesis to create new knowledge. My prediction is that then in another 18 months or 2 years, we'll have a postdoc. So suddenly they can actually do science and using all of the kind of different scientific kind of apparatus to test hypotheses. And then perhaps by the end of this decade, we'll have a professor in our pocket. So something that's as knowledgeable and expert at every human being, but has the ability to do science and ask the questions that humans haven't even asked, which I guess what some people refer to as being AGI.
Right. Okay. And what was your response to the Apple paper that seemed to get a lot of attention? That was looking at these large reasoning models and the issue of them reaching a certain level where the accuracy dropped to zero for a certain complexity of task.
Well,
Is that
well
something
first of
you're
all, I think the first question you have to ask yourself is, how useful are these technologies? Are they being used? And the fact is they are being used.
Yeah.
They're being used massively throughout. So people are valuing them, whether
Yeah.
they are reasoning or not. The also, it's unfair, I think, to criticize these technologies, given that the real breakthrough happened, 5 years ago, and it was only made available to people 3 years ago. And I think that it's unreasonable to be kind of criticizing where AI is. We know that there are many, many things that we need to continue to develop, innovations to develop in these technologies, whether it be reasoning or applying the scientific method or chain of thought, or even new mechanisms to allow them to operate much more on how our biological brains operate. Our brains
Right.
operate on the power of a light bulb. We learn very quickly. We only need one piece of data to learn what things are. We don't need 1,000
Mm.
images. We learn very quickly. So I think it's really unfair to be sort of criticizing these technologies, first of all, because I think the roadmap is going to kind of continue to develop, as I've said,
Yeah.
PhD postdoc professor. And then the second is does it add value? And the fact is, it does add value because it's being used by organizations and to drive better productivity and more creativity. So I don't care about really arguing about these kind of philosophical things. I'm very practical in some respects, which is it useful? And the fact is that it's massively useful.
Yeah. There's no doubt. I mean, I'm finding it useful every day.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to check for the hallucinations. Is that something that you see getting solved?
Oh, yeah.
How quickly will we be able to solve
Oh,
that problem?
yeah, because I think, again, just like what we do as human beings and what we do in the scientific method is that, as I said to you, if I've had some experience, some data, I make statistical assumptions. I assume that based on this experience, tomorrow the sun will rise, right? Statistically, it's likely that the sun will rise, or statistically likely that I know that Socrates is a man based on my experience. We as human beings actually are not very good at reasoning. We say that we're good at reasoning, but the fact is we have to write down these things in mathematics and whatnot to be able to actually do useful reasoning. Machines are going to be able to reason infinitely more effective than what we are. They're going to be able to do mathematics better than us. So as these tools start to develop system 2 type mechanisms, so reasoning and mathematics and proofs and experimentation, then I think they will start to actually even test their own hypotheses. I've experienced this. I assume that Socrates is a man. Let's now go out there and test the hypothesis. Let's actually go and see if I can prove that that is true. And then if it is true, then it becomes an axiom, becomes a truth that can be used to then make better deductions. Because at the moment, it's only statistics. I'm only 70% confident that Socrates is a man based on my experience. But if I can prove that Socrates is a man as a fact using the scientific method, then it becomes an axiom.
Right. And I guess in that context, that they'll be able to check for their own hallucinations, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I know we're coming up on time here, Daniel. I'm so grateful for this conversation. We have a lot of business leaders listening to this podcast. What do you think the imperatives are for those in leadership positions over the next, say, 5 years? As AI continues to gain traction.
Well, first of all, I think 5 years is too long to be experimenting. So I think I often say to people there are 3 things that differentiate business right now in the world of AI. The first is data. So if you're sitting on data that contains more useful insights than your competitors, then you have an advantage. It's data that makes AI smart. If you're not sitting on data, then your only real advantage is how quickly you can get to market. The existing kind of channels that you have, the existing infrastructure you have, and leveraging that. So it's more about time to market as opposed to having a data moat. The second is AI talent. Now, everybody's rebranded themselves as an AI expert over the past 3 years. They're all trying to build a career around AI, so build their own AI teams. Like say 8 years ago, it was machine learning and data science. So let's build our own data science team. Then again, they will then apply those technologies to solving their own problems. They'll lose talent. They'll be left with technologies that haven't scaled, that don't work, that are not supported. Forgive me for painting this picture, but we see it over and over and over again. So you need to be really sober about whether you can attract and retain deep AI talent, and also you need to be smart about what bets you place. If you're using AI right now to build an expense agent or an onboarding agent, I think you're wasting your time because your cloud providers, your ERP providers are going to provide you with those agents that do back office processes. I would focus on applying AI to solving problems that build innovations that differentiate your supply chain. Right? Just focus on the things that you as a business will mean that you are more competitive in the future. And that doesn't mean building an expenses bot. So there are lots of low-hanging fruit out there. But the other thing I also say to business leaders is, have you ever built and scaled software in your organization? Have you actually developed technology that you're using across your organization? And if you haven't, you're not going to do the same thing with AI. You're not going to have the infrastructure in place to support and maintain and innovate it. So then it's about placing the right bets, which comes to my final differentiator, which is leadership. If leadership are being seduced by technology consultants that say, we'll help you build your own technologies, you can internalize it, you can own the IP, they're going to make a lot of money, those technology consultancies, but those businesses are going to be left with technology that doesn't work, that isn't differentiated, they can't support. So, and that's going to happen over the next 3 years. So having leadership that understand about how to place the right bets, and focus on making sure that they're developing technologies that differentiate themselves and not just trying to build a career around AI, whether it be your CTO, a CIO, or even a CEO, is crucial now to the survival of your business. You don't have enough time to make these mistakes that we've made in the past, because those organizations that get it right are going to end up being more adaptive. They're going to be more intelligent. And if they're more intelligent, they're going to win.
Right. Got it. And then at the other end of the scale, if you're maybe a parent and you're thinking about, guiding your kids through to higher education, or you're just getting, started with your career, what are the imperatives as people enter the labor market?
It's again, this question a lot. It's super tricky because it's very hard to predict the future, and I often say to people, your children will have a leaning towards things that they're interested in, whether it be sports or art or whatever, mathematics, and I encourage them to do what they enjoy, because it's hard to figure out what are the right bets to place. I think our education system, unfortunately, is set up to test just for knowledge. I mean, we teach people stuff and then we give them a test to see, do you know your stuff? I think, we as businesses, or actually as even individuals, know that just testing for knowledge is not good enough anymore. We need to test for resilience and creativity and critical thinking and robustness. Our education systems need to be set up in a way that allows people to apply knowledge in ambiguous, complex situations where they can learn how to deal with their critical thinking issues, whether they can understand how creative they are and develop their creativity. But unfortunately, our education systems are not easily set up to be able to test for applied knowledge. And by the way, it's applied knowledge that we value as a business. We don't want to know that you can just know what a Gantt chart is. We want to know that you can run a project and look in the whites of people's eyes and to determine, what's an ambiguous requirement and what, experience. So how it's probably unfair, but how can we get our educational system to actually give people experience? And that's probably an unfair ask. But I do often say to
Well,
people,
just to pick you up on that, I know that there are, there's some experimental schools out there. I've seen documentaries on them where the whole orientation is around project work, and they put kids together in teams and they have them create little businesses or create art projects or whatever it may be, and weave in the curriculum to those activities. So I do think it's possible.
I do think it's possible as well. Doing it at scale would be amazing. And I've seen some of those pedagogies as well, and I also have a leaning towards them. But I think going back to your question, which is what would you advise? I think developing the ability to do critical thinking, to be able to kind of check your own biases, to be able to understand not just the happy path, but to understand where things might fail. So having like an engineering mindset or the ability to understand how to orchestrate complex systems and think about how to architect these systems, I think is an important skill. I think if you give somebody the ability to critically think, to be able to assess whether something is true, I think is a core and important skill.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And the architectural mindset, and that ability to see the bigger picture makes sense to me as AI continues to be able to very efficiently and effectively solve these narrow tasks. It seems to me as humans that, and you alluded to this earlier when you talk about people with sort of a history degree or a philosophy ability to see a bigger picture and pull from disparate sources and use that breadth to direct an AI into a particular
So I historically I've used the word orchestration. How do you orchestrate complex things, whether they be people or AIs, to architect solutions to big problems?
Yeah. And it reminds me of the work. Are you familiar with Ian McGilchrist?
Name rings a bell, sorry.
Where he talks about the sort of right brain dominance versus left brain dominance. And it seems to me what we're talking to here is an orientation to develop, a right brain orientation, i.e. a sort of a big picture orientation.
Yeah, potentially. I'm a big fan of balance, so I suspect that you need to develop both. But certainly, yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, we've got 3 minutes left, Daniel. Is there anything that you would have liked to touch on that we haven't talked about that you'd like to throw in as a final thought?
Obviously, there's a sort of a huge amount of kind of scaremongering, misunderstanding associated with these technologies, and a lot of kind of unknowns around what the future might look like. I often say to people that it's within their gift. The future is within our gift. So the best thing you can do is to educate yourself, to critically think, is this person here an expert telling me stuff, or are they just regurgitating what they've heard on LinkedIn? And to make sure that we're placing the right bets. I don't think we have, as a species, time to place the wrong bets over the next 3 or 4 years. So, and I think that ultimately it stems down to us educating ourselves. So that would be the thing that I'd ask people to go and focus on.
Brilliant. Well, thank you once again. This has been a really energizing conversation, full of insight, full of knowledge, and I just love the work you're doing. I love your focus on the ethics. It's it's very encouraging that we have leaders like you with such focus on the human element as we move forward with this. It's great.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. And we'll put the links to Constium, the work you're doing at Satalia, the moral.me. That's live now, is it?
It's in alpha, so
In alpha.
probably not yet. But if you go to mole.me, there's a website that you can sign up to.
You can sign up and get involved. That sounds like a great thing to get involved in. Wonderful. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks once again. Thank you, Daniel.
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.